r/relationship_advice. 250 pounds gym bro mocked me at pool on anniversary. Revenge was sweet. #chunk1. The tears wouldn't stop coming, and I hated him for that most of all. Not because of what he'd said, though his words were still ringing in my ears like some horrible echo chamber, but because he'd made me cry. In public. At a 5-star resort. On my wedding anniversary. The one day I've been looking forward to for months. My name is Sarah, I'm 28, and I'm sitting in a cabana chair trying to hide my face behind a towel while my husband Marcus rubs my back and whispers angry things under his breath. We'd been at Coral Bay Resort for exactly 4 hours. 4 hours of what was supposed to be a perfect weekend getaway to celebrate 5 years of marriage. Let me back up. We arrived at the resort around 10 a.m., checked into our ocean view suite, and I changed into my swimsuit, a cute navy one-piece with white piping that I'd picked out specifically for this trip. I'm not going to lie and say I feel totally comfortable in a swimsuit these days. After years of not training seriously, I carry weight differently than I used to. My shoulders are softer, my abs aren't visible, and I've made peace with that. Or at least, I thought I had. Marcus and I headed down to the pool around 1 p.m. when the sun was highest and the water looked absolutely inviting. The resort's main pool is this gorgeous infinity situation overlooking the ocean, with swim-up bars and cabanas and those lounge chairs that cost more than some people's cars. We grabbed a spot near the shallow end, and I was genuinely happy. Marcus was happy. We were laughing about something stupid, and he kept squeezing my hand. I decided to actually swim instead of just lounging. I know, shocking. But I used to be pretty serious about swimming. Like, Olympic serious. I was part of the 2016 Olympic team as an alternate for freestyle events, never competed, but I trained my entire adolescence for that. It was my whole life until a shoulder injury during college put an end to my competitive career. I'd made peace with that too, or so I thought. These days, I barely get in the pool. But something about being at a resort, with the water looking so perfect and blue, made me want to actually use these muscles I used to take for granted. I stood up and was about to walk toward the deep end when I heard him. Oh, this should be interesting, a voice boomed across the pool deck. Loud. Confident. Cruel in a way that made my stomach drop immediately. I turned to look. Of course there was a guy. Of course he was massive, like, genuinely huge, the kind of muscular that makes you wonder about his actual daily food intake. He was standing with a group of his buddies, all of them in various states of athletic build, all of them now looking at me with expressions that ranged from amused to uncomfortable. Check this out, he continued, and I realized with growing horror that he was talking about me. We got a real aquatic athlete over here, boys. Look at those strokes she's about to attempt. He was mocking my body. The way I looked in my swimsuit. The assumption that I wouldn't be a good swimmer. I froze. I actually froze mid-step like my body was trying to make me invisible. I give her about 30 seconds before she's exhausted, he said, loud enough that other guests were turning to look. Maybe she should stick to the shallow end. Wouldn't want her to get out of breath. His friends laughed. Not all of them, but enough. And that's the thing about public humiliation, it doesn't matter if everyone's laughing or just a few people. Your brain registers it the same way, as exposure, as being seen in the worst possible light, as everyone joining in on the joke. I looked back at Marcus. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He started to stand up, my wonderful, protective husband was ready to walk over there and probably make a scene, but I grabbed his hand and shook my head. Sitting back down, he whispered, we're telling management. We're filing a complaint. We're getting his room shut down. But I wasn't really hearing him. I was hearing the guy's voice. The mockery. The casual cruelty of someone who looked at me and decided I was small enough to push around. I decided I was going to try to swim anyway. I don't know why. Pride, maybe. Stubbornness. Some part of me that wasn't quite ready to let him win that easily. I walked to the deep end on shaky legs. The water was perfect, cool and clean and inviting. I pushed off the wall and started to swim. And that's when he really went to town. Oh man, look at the technique, he called out, and his buddies erupted. She's really going for it. Swimming hard. Using her whole body. He was narrating my swim like it was a comedy show, and I was the entertainment. Other guests were now deliberately watching, waiting to see if he'd keep going. He did. Of course he did. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a real Olympic contender on our hands. His voice boomed across the entire pool area. Someone get the cameras ready. This is a historic moment. I made it about 50 meters before I got out. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it while being watched, while being mocked, while feeling like my body was public property for ridicule. My hands were shaking as I climbed out of the pool, and I could feel every single eye on me as I walked back to Marcus. And that's when I started crying. Not a little emotional tear, a full, ugly cry that I couldn't stop, couldn't control. Marcus pulled me into our cabana, wrapped me in a towel, and held me while I sobbed into his chest. He kept saying he was sorry, that it wasn't my fault, that guy was an asshole. And all of that was true. But the thing that hurt most wasn't what he'd said. It was that he'd made me ashamed of something I used to love. It was that he'd looked at me, made a judgment, and I believed it. #chunk2. We spent the rest of the afternoon in our suite. Marcus ordered room service, we watched some mindless Netflix show, and I tried to pretend that everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. Everything felt bruised, even though nothing physical had happened to me. By dinner time, I'd worked myself into this weird state where I wasn't even angry anymore, I was just hollow. We had reservations at the resort's fancy restaurant, Coral, and I kept wondering if we should cancel. What if that guy was there? What if he recognized me? What if he started up again? We're going, Marcus said firmly when I voiced this thought. We're not hiding. That's what he wants you to feel small enough to disappear. Fuck that. There was something in his tone that made me sit up straighter. He was right. We weren't leaving our resort in shame because of some asshole who probably wouldn't even remember this by tomorrow. Dinner was actually nice. The restaurant was sophisticated, quieter, and there was no sign of Mr. Jim Bro or his crew. We ordered wine and seafood, and Marcus made me laugh with some stupid story about his college roommate. For a few hours, I almost felt normal again. But when we got back to our room around 11 p.m., something shifted in me. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, replaying the pool incident over and over. Not in the way where I was torturing myself exactly, more like my brain was trying to solve a puzzle I didn't even know was unsolvable. And then, around midnight, a thought struck me so clearly that I actually sat up in bed. He'd humiliated me in front of people. In public. Based entirely on an assumption. And I'd let him. The old Sarah, the Sarah who'd trained 6 hours a day, who'd pushed through pain, who'd competed at the highest levels of swimming, that Sarah would never have just gotten out of the water. That Sarah would have finished that swim. That Sarah would have shown him exactly what she was capable of. But the current Sarah? The Sarah who'd been hiding for years, who'd made peace with mediocrity, who'd convinced herself she was fine living a smaller version of her life. That Sarah had gotten out of the water. I looked over at Marcus, sleeping peacefully beside me. I didn't wake him. Instead, I got my phone and did something I hadn't done in years. I googled the resort's pool schedule. The lap swim was at 7 a.m. tomorrow morning. The resort offered it as an exclusive amenity for guests, and according to the website, it was usually attended by people training for triathlons and the occasional serious swimmer. My stomach flipped when I read that. Serious swimmers. People who actually knew what they were doing. People who might judge me as harshly as I judged myself. I put my phone down and stared at the ceiling for a long time. What was I even thinking? That I'd go swim laps at 7 a.m. and somehow that would make me feel better about what happened at the pool? That would be running away in the opposite direction. That wouldn't solve anything. Unless I didn't run away at all. The idea started forming slowly, then crystallized so suddenly that I had to get out of bed. I walked out onto the balcony of our suite. The ocean was dark and infinite, and the night air was warm and salt-tinged and perfect. And I stood there thinking about what it would actually take to prove something to that guy. To prove something to myself. By the time I came back to bed, I'd made a decision that was either brilliant or completely insane. Possibly both. When Marcus woke up at 6:30 a.m., I was already dressed in my swimsuit and cover-up, sipping coffee on the balcony. "What are you doing?" he asked groggily, stumbling out to join me. "I'm going to the lap swim," I said. I hadn't told him my full plan yet. Wasn't entirely sure I was actually going through with it. "That's great, babe. Really great." He kissed my temple. "Doing something for yourself." "I like it." He went to shower, and I stayed out on the balcony, my heart doing an irregular rhythm in my chest. The thing is, the lap swim felt safe. Structured. No mockery happened at 7 a.m. in a designated lap area where people were actually there to swim seriously. I could get back in the water without an audience. I could remind myself of what my body was capable of when I wasn't being watched and judged and laughed at. I spent the next 2 hours in that lap pool, and it was transcendent. My muscles remembered. My breathing remembered. My muscle memory was still there, still intact, still waiting for me to come back. I did 30 lengths, building intensity, and by the end, I was breathing hard but feeling alive in a way I hadn't in years. The lap pool attendant, a middle-aged woman named Diane, even complimented my technique as I was leaving. "You're trained," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Because in that moment, I was absorbing what that meant. I was trained. I was still trained. The years hadn't erased it. My shoulder was fine. I was fine. More than fine, I was actually extraordinary, and somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that. When I got back to the suite, Marcus was ordering breakfast. He took one look at my face and grinned. "You look happy," he said. "I feel happy," I replied. And then, because I was still riding the high of feeling like myself again, I asked him a question. "What if we went to the main pool around 2 p.m. today? During the busy time?" He looked at me carefully. "Are you sure?" I wasn't, actually. But I nodded anyway. "We could grab drinks and lounge," I continued, my brain racing ahead. "Just be there. Casual. No big deal." What I was actually thinking was, I want to see if he's there again. And if he is, I want him to see me. I want him to see that I'm not ashamed. That I'm not hiding. That he was wrong about me. "Okay," Marcus said slowly. "If you want to. But Sarah, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." "I know," I said. And I meant it. But I was going to do it anyway. #Chunk3. The problem with making bold decisions at midnight is that they seem a lot less bold when you're standing at the edge of the main pool at 1:47 p.m., watching for a muscular man with an ego the size of a yacht. Marcus and I had claimed 2 loungers near the deep end, drink sweating in the afternoon heat. I was wearing my good swimsuit, the one I brought for actual swimming, not lounging, and I'd styled my hair in a high ponytail that felt like armor and admission all at once. I was here. I was visible. I was ready. Except I wasn't sure I was ready at all. "He might not even be here," Marcus offered, reading the anxiety on my face. He was being supportive in that careful way husbands are when their wives are about to do something that could either be empowering or spectacularly embarrassing. "I know," I said, sipping my piña colada even though my stomach was too tight to process it. Part of me hopes he isn't. But part of me, the part that had been waking up with purpose this morning, the part that had felt invincible in that lap pool, wanted him to be here more than anything. The resort pool was packed. Families with kids, couples like us, a few groups of friends. The water sparkled under the afternoon sun, and I found myself studying it the way I used to study pools before competitions. Depth, clarity, temperature. The small imperfections in the surface that told you things about currents and wind. "There," Marcus said quietly, nodding toward the tiki bar near the shallow end. My heart stopped. It was him. The gym bro from yesterday was holding court with what looked like the same group of friends, a beer in hand, his massive frame somehow taking up more space than physically possible. He was shirtless, of course, because of course he was. His chest was a geography of muscles, his biceps ridiculous, his entire existence apparently designed to make people feel inadequate. I felt Marcus tense beside me. "Don't," I said, putting my hand on his arm. "Don't do anything. Let me handle this." "Sarah, you don't have to." "I know. But I want to." The thing was, I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to happen. Confrontation? Acknowledgement? Some kind of apology? I'd spent the last 18 hours replaying our interactions, but I hadn't actually thought through what winning would look like. I just knew that I needed him to know that he was wrong about me. I stood up before I could talk myself out of it. Marcus grabbed my hand. Just swimming, I told him. I'm just going to swim. And that was true. I was going to swim. Whether or not he noticed me was almost irrelevant now. The point was that I was going to get in that pool and be exactly who I was, unapologetically and without permission. I walked to the shallow end, acutely aware of eyes on me. Not just his eyes, though I could feel those too, but the eyes of other people. Assessing. Judging. Waiting to see what the woman in the good swimsuit was about to do. I dove. The water embraced me, cool and perfect, and for a moment I was underwater where nothing could touch me. When I surfaced and began my first lap, it was with the kind of deliberate, flawless technique that had taken years to develop. Long strokes. Controlled breathing. My body moving through the water like it was supposed to, like I was supposed to. I did 5 laps before I noticed the shift in the atmosphere. The noise level had changed. People were watching. Not in the mocking way from yesterday, but in the way that serious athletes are watched when they do something that demands attention. By my 7th lap, I could feel the gym bro stare. I could feel him trying to understand what he was seeing. Yesterday, I'd been struggling, floundering, pathetic. Today, I was moving through this pool like I owned it. I finished my 10th lap at the deep end and pulled myself out, breathing hard but controlled. I could have kept going, my body felt like it could swim for hours, but I wanted him to see me stop. To see me choose when I was done, not because I was exhausted, but because I was satisfied. That's when I made the mistake of looking directly at him. He was standing up now, his friend still sitting, clearly confused about what was happening. His expression was complicated, not angry exactly, but unsettled. Reassessing. He looked like he was trying to solve an equation that didn't add up. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw a flicker of recognition. Not of my face, but of something else. A recalibration of his assumptions about me. Then his friend said something, and he sat back down, but the damage was done. He'd seen. He knew something was different. I tailed off slowly, deliberately, making sure to give him every opportunity to fully absorb the person I actually was, not the person he decided I was yesterday. When I got back to Marcus, my legs were shaking. That was amazing, he said, and there was something like awe in his voice. Sarah, that was actually incredible. Thank you, I said, but my attention was divided. I was watching Jim Bro out of the corner of my eye. He was trying to act casual, drinking his beer, talking to his friends, but he kept glancing at the pool. At me. Do you feel better? Marcus asked. Did I? I wasn't sure. I felt different, certainly. I felt more like myself. But I also felt like I'd opened a door I wasn't entirely sure how to close. There was an energy in the air now, a question that had been raised by my performance in the water. He'd humiliated me based on an assumption. And I'd just contradicted that assumption in the most public way possible. What he did with that information next, what he'd say, how he'd react, that was the complicated part. That was where this could go in a direction I couldn't control. I feel like myself, I said finally. I feel like I remembered who I am. Marcus kissed my forehead. Then it was worth it. I wasn't entirely convinced of that yet. But I was about to find out. #Chunk4. The rest of the afternoon was a study in controlled chaos. I stayed in the lounger next to Marcus, ostensibly reading my book, but actually hyper-aware of every movement in my peripheral vision. Jim Bro was still there, still with his friends, and the energy had definitely shifted. He'd gone from casually cruel to something more complicated. Occasionally he'd laugh, too loud, I thought, performing normalcy for his friends, but his eyes would drift back to the pool. Back to me. You're not reading that book, Marcus said at one point, not unkindly. I know, I admitted. Are you worried he's going to say something? I'm worried about a lot of things, I said honestly. I'm worried this was a stupid idea. I'm worried I've made it worse. I'm worried that I don't know. Changed the dynamic in some way that I can't control. Marcus set down his own book. Sarah, look at me. I did. You swam. That's all you did. You swam beautifully, and people watched. That's not a crime. That's not an invitation for anything. He was right, logically. But logic and social dynamics were different things, and I'd learned something about human nature over the years. When you challenge someone's narrative about you, they don't always respond well. They either double down on the original story, or they get defensive, or they try to reassert dominance in some other way. I was so focused on Jim Bro that I almost didn't notice when he stood up around 4 p.m. and headed toward the concierge desk inside the resort. His friend stayed at the pool, but he was gone for about 15 minutes. When he came back, he looked satisfied about something. Purposeful. Like he'd made a decision. That's when the knot in my stomach tightened. What? Marcus asked, watching my face. I don't know, I said. Something. He went inside for a bit, and now he looks like he knows something we don't. Maybe he just went to order a sandwich. Maybe, I said, but I didn't believe it. Around 5 p.m., just as the sun was starting to move lower in the sky and some of the crowd was beginning to thin, Jim Bro stood up again. This time, he walked directly toward us. My heart started doing that unpleasant fluttering thing it does when you know something significant is about to happen. Hey, he said, his voice less boisterous than yesterday but somehow more intimidating for it. He was standing in that space between my lounger and Marcus's, uninvited. Up close, I could see that he was actually younger than I'd thought, maybe 26 or 27. His confidence had made him seem older yesterday, but today, with it shaken, he looked almost boyish. Almost human. Marcus sat up slightly, his body language shifting into protective mode. Hi, I said, keeping my voice neutral. So, I was wondering, Jim Bro said, and there was an edge to his casual tone now. Are you like, a swimmer or something? It was such a stupid question, delivered with such obvious irritation at being wrong about something, that I almost laughed. Almost. I was, actually, I said. A long time ago. Right, he said, and I could see him processing this, reorganizing his mental filing system. I kind of figured that out. Nobody just swims like that unless they've done it seriously. He paused, and I could see him struggling with something. Pride, I realized. He was struggling with pride. I might have been. I was kind of a dick yesterday. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was an acknowledgement of dickishness that stopped short of actual contrition. But it was something. Marcus's hand found mine, squeezing gently. You were, I agreed simply. He nodded, jaw tight. Yeah, well. I didn't know. I mean, I didn't expect. He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. My buddy inside told me you apparently won some Olympic trials or something. Is that true? Of course his friend told him. Of course someone had gossiped, had filled in the narrative for him. Part of me felt relief. I hadn't had to confront him directly, hadn't had to explain myself. Part of me felt something like disappointment. The clean resolution through my own actions had been compromised by outside information. I was an Olympic alternate, I said carefully. I trained for years. Then I got injured, and I stopped. But you could still. He gestured vaguely at the pool. Obviously. He flinched at the dryness in my tone. Look, I'm just saying, how was I supposed to know? You were struggling in the pool yesterday. You looked like you didn't even know how to swim. I was floundering, I corrected. Because I've been out of the water for years and I was self-conscious. Because you and your friends were mocking me loud enough to hear underwater. I wasn't struggling because I don't know how to swim. I was struggling because I was humiliated. The words came out colder than I expected, sharper. Marcus squeezed my hand again, and I realized I was trembling slightly. Jim Bro shifted his weight, and I could see him doing some calculation, some reassessment. I apologized, he said, and there was a note of defensiveness creeping in. I said I was being a dick. You said you were a dick, I corrected. You didn't apologize to me. You made an assumption about me based on what you saw for approximately 5 minutes, and then you decided I deserved to be mocked for it. That's not my problem to solve by being gracious about it. He stared at me for a moment, and I could see the moment his defensiveness started to calcify into something harder. Okay, well, I guess I know where I stand, he said. You stand exactly where you put yourself, I said. I'm not angry at you. I'm just not going to pretend you didn't do what you did, or that a half apology makes it okay. He turned away, his shoulders stiff, and walked back to his friends. I watched him sit down and say something to them, watched their expressions shift to something like sympathy or agreement or vindication. I couldn't tell which from this distance. Okay, that was intense, Marcus said quietly. I know. Are you okay? I thought about it. The adrenaline was fading, leaving something more complicated in its wake. I'd stood up for myself without screaming or crying or being cruel in return. I'd set a boundary and held it. But I'd also made an enemy out of someone who had access to me. We were both at the same resort for at least 2 more days. Ask me later, I said finally. Right now I just feel a little sick. Marcus pulled me closer. We can go back to the room. No, I said. No, I want to stay. I want to be visible. That was the whole point, right? To stop hiding. But as I sat there with Marcus's arm around me, watching Jim Bro deliberately not look at us while his friend stole occasional glances in our direction, I realized that visibility had a cost. And I wasn't entirely sure I'd calculated it correctly. Chunk 5. The rest of that afternoon dissolved into an exercise in hyper-awareness. I couldn't relax into the lounger the way I had before. Every time Jim Bro's friend group laughed, I felt it like a small electric shock. Were they laughing at something he'd said about me? Were they strategizing some form of retaliation? I hated the paranoia, but I couldn't seem to shut it off. Marcus suggested we get dinner early in our room, and I agreed immediately. Part of me wanted to stay visible, to prove I wasn't intimidated, but another part of me, the pragmatic part, recognized that I was exhausted. The confrontation had drained something essential from me, and I needed to recover. We ordered room service around 6. The food was excellent, as everything at this resort was, but I barely tasted it. Marcus kept trying to engage me in normal conversation, asking about the book I'd been pretending to read, suggesting we book a couple's massage for tomorrow, but my attention kept drifting to the window that overlooked the pool area. By 7 o'clock, the pool had mostly cleared out. Jim Bro and his friends were still there, though, along with a handful of other determined sunbathers trying to squeeze the last rays out of the evening. I could see them from our room on the 4th floor, little figures grouped around loungers, and I found myself trying to read their body language from this distance. It was futile, of course. I couldn't see anything from here except general shapes and movement. Sarah, Marcus said gently. You're doing it again. Doing what? Spiraling. You're spiraling, and it's not going to help anything. He was right, but knowing something intellectually and being able to stop doing it were two different things. My body was running on adrenaline and anticipation, and I didn't have an off switch. What if this was a mistake? I asked suddenly. What if I should have just let it go? Marcus set down his fork. Do you actually believe that, or are you just scared? Both, I said honestly. I'm scared that I made things worse. I'm scared that I turned myself into a target, and now I'm stuck at the same resort with him for 2 more days. I'm scared that nothing I said actually penetrated his brain, and he just thinks I'm an arrogant bitch who wouldn't accept his apology. Is that what you think he thinks? I think he thinks whatever his friends are telling him to think, I said. He seemed like he actually didn't know until one of them told him about the Olympic trials thing. Which means his entire revised understanding of me is based on secondhand gossip, not on anything I actually did or said. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Does it matter how he gets there, as long as he gets to understanding? It was a fair question, and it made me pause. Did it matter? I'd gotten some satisfaction from swimming beautifully in front of him. I'd gotten some satisfaction from standing my ground when he tried to give me an incomplete apology. But would either of those things have shifted his perspective if his friend hadn't provided that information? Probably not. He would have kept telling himself his original story, that I was just some out-of-shape woman who got defensive when mocked. I don't know, I admitted. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from my mother, asking how the anniversary trip was going. I ignored it. I didn't have the emotional energy to explain the situation to her, especially since she'd already expressed concerns about me not being social enough during vacations. By 8 o'clock, the sky had darkened to deep purple, and the resort's poolside lighting had come on, soft, amber lights that made everything look slightly dreamlike. We could hear music from the bar area near the pool, something mellow and jazzy. The resort had that perfect evening atmosphere that had probably seduced Marcus and me into booking this place in the first place. It felt ruined now. Let's do something tomorrow, Marcus said, clearly trying to redirect my attention. Let's plan an excursion. There's a hiking trail about 40 minutes from here that's supposed to be beautiful. We could pack a picnic, spend the whole day away from the resort. It was a kind offer, and it came from the right place. But I could also hear the subtext, asterisk let's hide. Let's get away. Let's make this less awkward, asterisk. No, I said. No, I'm not going to spend the rest of my anniversary avoiding him. That's not what this was about. Then what was it about? Marcus asked, not accusingly, just genuinely curious. I thought about how I'd felt yesterday, standing at the pool's edge, paralyzed by shame and anger. I thought about how I'd felt this morning, diving in, remembering what my body could do. I thought about how I'd felt during that awful conversation just hours ago, stating facts about myself to a stranger who hadn't earned the right to know them. It was about not disappearing, I said finally. It was about reminding myself, and maybe him, that I'm not what I look like. I'm not what someone else assumes in 5 minutes. I have a history, I have skills, I have value that doesn't fit in their narrative about me. And has that worked? I don't know yet, I said. Ask me in 2 days when we leave. Around 11, Marcus fell asleep. I stayed awake, watching old swimming videos on my phone, clips from competitions I'd done years ago, before the injury. There was something painful and addictive about watching myself at 23, powerful and competent, moving through water like it was home. I'd given that up. Not just because of the injury, though that had been the physical impetus. I'd given it up because after the injury, it felt safer to stop being that person. Safer to be invisible. Safer to be whoever I was supposed to be once the athletic version of myself was no longer possible. But sitting in the dark of our resort room, watching my younger self cut through the water, I realized something. Invisibility isn't actually safe. It's just a different kind of pain. I closed the videos and lay down beside Marcus, but sleep didn't come. Instead, I listened to the ambient sounds of the resort, distant conversations, the occasional splash from the late-night swimmers, the hum of the air conditioning. And I waited for morning, for the next chapter of this unplanned confrontation, unsure whether I'd made myself stronger or just more vulnerable. Chunk 6. Morning came too early and too bright. I woke to sunlight streaming through the gap in the blackout curtains, my body stiff from a night of poor sleep. Marcus was already up, I could hear the shower running. My phone showed 7:47 a.m. The pool wouldn't get busy until at least 9. I had time to decide what I was going to do. Because that's what last night had clarified for me, I wasn't actually done with Jim Bro. The confrontation yesterday had been about defending myself in the moment, but it hadn't been strategic. It had been reactive. And now I was lying in bed, my competitive instincts, dormant for so long I'd almost forgotten I had them, suddenly screaming to life. I could challenge him formally. I could make it a real event, not just a spontaneous humiliation. I could make him understand that what happened yesterday wasn't a fluke, wasn't just me getting lucky. It was me being better. The thought made my heart race in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. Marcus emerged from the shower with a towel around his waist, his hair still dripping. You're awake, he said, surprised. You got maybe 2 hours of sleep. I know, I said. Sarah. I want to challenge him to a swim race, I blurted out. A formal one. Today. In front of witnesses. Marcus rose. You've got to be kidding. I'm not. Think about it. Yesterday was one off. He could tell himself it was a fluke, that I caught him off guard, that he was hungover or whatever excuse his ego needs. But if I challenge him properly, in front of everyone, with rules, with witnesses, then there's no way to rationalize it. Sarah, that's— Marcus sat down on the edge of the bed, water from his wet hair dripping onto the comforter. He didn't seem to notice. That's not healthy. That's you feeding the cycle. How is it feeding the cycle? I sat up, suddenly defensive. How is it different from what I already did yesterday? Because yesterday was spontaneous, Marcus said carefully. It was heat of the moment. This would be deliberate. Calculated. You'd be hunting him. The word hunting hung in the air between us like something sharp. And the worst part was, he wasn't entirely wrong. I was thinking about hunting. About tracking and planning and executing a perfect takedown. But didn't I deserve to feel that way? Didn't he deserve to feel hunted for a change? I don't care, I said. I'm doing it. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the pool area below. The early morning sun made the water gleam like hammered silver. What exactly are you hoping will happen? He asked quietly. Best case scenario. You beat him again, he's humiliated again. What then? Does your pain go away? Does this feel like closure? I didn't answer because I wasn't sure of the answer. The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure what I was hoping for anymore. Validation? Proof? Some kind of permanent, irrefutable evidence that I was worth something? I just need him to know, I said finally. He already knows, Marcus said. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Whatever he needed to know, he knows it now. But you're not going to believe it until you believe it about yourself. The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth I didn't want to examine too closely. But I pushed past it. I'm going to the pool, I announced, getting out of bed. And I'm going to ask him. If you don't want to come, that's fine, but I'm doing this with or without you. Sarah. Don't, I said. Don't try to talk me out of it. I know what I'm doing. I wasn't sure that was true, but I was committed now. Committed to the point where backing down would feel like a betrayal of something essential. I showered and changed into my swimsuit, trying not to think about how this looked from the outside. Trying not to hear Marcus's voice in my head calling it unhealthy. Trying not to acknowledge that he might be right. The pool area was quieter at this hour, only a few early risers swimming laps or reading on the loungers. No sign of Jim Bro yet. I sat down with a coffee from the resort cafe and waited, my leg bouncing with nervous energy. Marcus didn't come down with me. He stayed in the room, and I could feel that absence like a weight. Our anniversary trip was becoming something different than what we'd planned. Something more complicated. Something that was revealing cracks I hadn't known were there. By 8:30, the crowd was starting to build. A few of Jim Bro's friends appeared, ordering drinks at the pool bar. And then, at 8:47, he showed up in his oversized sunglasses and his carefully arranged outfit, the same confident swagger as yesterday. He didn't notice me at first. He was too busy with his friends, too busy being the center of his own universe. I finished my coffee. Stood up. Started walking toward him. The logical part of my brain, the part that sounded exactly like Marcus, was screaming that this was a terrible idea. That I should walk away, go back to the room, book that hiking excursion, and let this go. But another part of me, a part I'd buried for years under layers of safety and invisibility, was waking up. And it wanted to fight. When Jim Bro saw me approaching, his face did something interesting. It flickered through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion, then wariness, then something that might have been amusement or might have been dread. I couldn't quite tell which. "Hey," I said, standing in front of him with my hands on my hips. "You said you'd cut back your arrogance if I proved I could swim." "I'm calling that bluff." His friends had gone quiet. One of them was already pulling out his phone. "I want you," I continued, "to race me. Today. Right now. In front of everyone. 50 meters. Best of 3. Jim Bro pushed his sunglasses up on his head. His jaw was working, like he was calculating angles, considering his options. And I could see the exact moment he realized he couldn't back down. Not with his friends watching. Not with his whole identity built on the idea that he was physically superior. "You're on," he said finally, and something in my chest twisted, because I'd just committed to something I wasn't entirely sure I could control the consequences of. "Okay," I heard myself say. 30 minutes. Tell the lifeguards." And then I turned and walked away, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. I'd just declared war all over again. #Chunk7. I made it back to the room in a daze, my mind spinning through what I'd just done. The hallway seemed longer than it had that morning, the carpet muffling my footsteps as I replayed the last 5 minutes over and over. "You're on," that's all it had taken. 2 words, and I'd locked myself into something that suddenly felt a lot more real than it had when I was sitting alone with my coffee. Marcus was on the balcony when I came in, still in his clothes from earlier, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when he heard the door close, and I could see the question forming on his face before he even asked it. "You did it," he said. Not a question. "I did it," I confirmed, moving to stand beside him at the railing. The morning was already getting hot, the sun climbing steadily higher in the cloudless sky. 30 minutes. 50 meters. Best of 3. Marcus set his phone down on the small table between the lounge chairs. "Sarah." "Don't," I said, holding up a hand. "I know what you're going to say. I know this looks bad. I know it looks obsessive and unhealthy and like I'm not letting it go. But I'm already committed. Half the resort is probably already setting up bleachers." That wasn't quite true, but it might as well have been. Within minutes of me walking away from Jim Bro and his friends, the news had spread like wildfire. By the time I'd gotten back to the room, I'd seen at least 20 people heading toward the pool with that specific kind of excitement that only comes from anticipating public humiliation. Someone had posted something on the resort's group chat. Someone else had told a friend. And now, apparently, everyone wanted to watch the rematch. "You need to eat something," Marcus said, and I was struck by how resigned he sounded. Like he'd accepted that he couldn't stop me, so he was pivoting to damage control. "When's the last time you ate?" I tried to remember. Dinner yesterday? Had I even finished that? The day felt like it was happening to someone else, events piling on top of each other without coherence. "I'll grab something," I said vaguely. "Sarah. Eat. Now." Marcus stood up with a firmness I recognized. This was his problem-solving voice. If he couldn't stop the race, he could at least make sure I wasn't doing it on an empty stomach. "I'm ordering room service. You're going to have protein and carbs. You're going to hydrate. You're going to stretch. And then we're going to talk about what you're actually doing here." I wanted to argue, but honestly, the thought of food made me realize I was starving. My hands were shaking slightly, whether from adrenaline or low blood sugar, I couldn't tell. I nodded, and Marcus immediately picked up the room phone. While he ordered, I went into the bathroom and stared at my reflection. My hair was still wet from the shower, pulled back in a practical ponytail. My face was pale except for 2 spots of color high on my cheekbones. I looked like someone about to go into battle, not someone about to participate in a friendly swimming competition. The thing was, it didn't feel friendly anymore. Somewhere between last night and this morning, something had shifted inside me. The righteous anger had curdled into something more complex, something that tasted like hunger. Real, visceral hunger. I'd spent years after my injury telling myself that I was okay with being small, with being invisible, with being the kind of person people didn't look at twice. I'd built a comfortable life around that invisibility. A good job, a loving husband, a safe existence where I never had to prove myself to anyone. Where I could hide all the parts of me that were too big, too competitive, too much. And then Jim Bro had dragged all of that out into the sunlight and mocked it, and it had cracked something open inside me that I'd spent years trying to seal shut. The knock on the door came 20 minutes later. Marcus collected the tray and set it on the small table on the balcony. Grilled chicken, sweet potato, a huge salad, fresh fruit, and a bottle of electrolyte drink that I suspected he'd specifically requested. "Eat," he said, sitting down across from me. I ate. The food was good, and my body was apparently willing to cooperate even if my mind was somewhere else entirely. Marcus watched me with the expression of someone dealing with a problem they didn't know how to solve. "Talk to me," he said finally. "Not about the race. About what's actually happening here." I set down my fork and looked at him. Really looked at him. My husband, who'd married me knowing I was the kind of person who'd quit everything after one setback. Who'd built his life around someone he thought was content to be small. When I was swimming competitively, I started slowly, I was someone. I had an identity that wasn't just wife or employee or friend. I was Sarah Chen, swimmer, that was the core of who I was. Marcus nodded, waiting. After the injury, I told myself I was happy to let that go. I told myself it was a relief. That I didn't have to live for that anymore, that I could just be normal. I paused, picking at the edge of the sweet potato. But the truth is, I think I've been dead inside ever since. Just pretending to be alive. And yesterday, Marcus prompted. Yesterday, I remembered what it felt like to be that person again. Even just for a few seconds in the pool. And it made me realize how much I've been missing it. How much I've been missing myself. Marcus reached across the table and took my hand. I know that, he said quietly. But I'm worried that this race isn't actually about remembering yourself. I'm worried it's about proving something to him. To prove that your worth is tied to being better than someone else. And Sarah, you're worth so much more than that. The thing was, he wasn't wrong. But he also wasn't entirely right. And I didn't have time to untangle the difference before I looked at the clock on my phone and saw that we had 15 minutes before I needed to be at the pool. I need to go warm up, I said, squeezing his hand before I let go. Marcus looked like he wanted to say more, but he just nodded. I'll be there, he said. Watching. I changed into a fresh swimsuit, not the one I'd worn yesterday, but the one I used to train in years ago, the one that still fit perfectly because my body hadn't really changed even if everything else had. I stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom and took a breath. 15 minutes until everything changed again. I was ready. #Chunk 8. The pool deck was already crowded when I emerged from the resort building, and I had to do a double take. There had to be at least 200 people gathered along the edges of the Olympic-sized pool. Someone had actually set up bleachers, real bleachers, the kind you'd see at a professional competition. The resort staff had cordoned off the lap lanes, and I could see the lifeguard standing at attention, looking both bemused and concerned about his sudden responsibility for what had apparently become an event. The murmur that went through the crowd when I walked out told me they'd been waiting. Speculating. Wondering if I'd actually show up. Jim Bro was already at the pool, and he looked different in the morning light. Smaller, somehow, though that might have just been my perspective shifting. He was showing off for his friends, flexing and talking loudly about how this would be over in like 2 minutes, tops. His confidence was almost painful to watch, the confidence of someone who'd never experienced failure, or at least not in a way that stuck. Marcus was in the front row of the bleachers, front and center, his camera around his neck. When he saw me, he gave me a small nod. Not approval, exactly, but solidarity. The resort's event coordinator, a woman I'd never seen before but who was apparently taking this very seriously, approached us both with a clipboard. She explained the rules: 50-meter sprint, best of 3 heats, standard Olympic timing. Someone had actually called the resort sports director, who was now standing by with a whistle and a genuine stopwatch. This was really happening. I walked to the edge of my assigned lane and began to stretch. Around me, the crowd settled into hushed anticipation. I could feel Jim Bro's gaze on me, probably waiting for me to look intimidated, to back down, to give him something to mock before we even started. I didn't look at him. I looked at the water instead, at the way the morning sun caught the ripples and turned them gold. I thought about all the mornings I'd looked at pools just like this one and felt nothing. All the years of walking past them, of telling myself I was past that life, that I didn't need it anymore. I'd been lying to myself. The whistle blew for the first heat. I dove before the thought could fully form, my body remembering what my mind had tried to forget. The water closed around me like a homecoming. Every muscle remembered. Every breath, every stroke, every subtle rotation of my shoulders, it was all still there, encoded in the fiber of my being. I came up after the first turn and caught a glimpse of Jim Bro thrashing beside me. He was strong, I could see that, all brute power and muscle. But he had no rhythm. No efficiency. He was fighting the water instead of flowing through it. I touched the wall at 47 seconds. When I turned around, Jim Bro was still going, his face red with exertion. He finished at 52 seconds and immediately pulled himself out, breathing heavily, looking shocked. The crowd went absolutely silent. That's one, Jim Bro managed, between heaving breaths. I was just warming up. He wasn't wrong. The second heat came and went, and I was faster, 45 seconds. Jim Bro shaved 2 seconds off his time, finishing at 50 seconds, and I could see the panic flickering across his face now. This wasn't going the way he'd expected. In the third heat, I went all out. No holding back, no thought of anything except the pure mechanics of moving my body through water as fast as it would go. 43 seconds. A personal best I hadn't hit since before my injury. Jim Bro didn't even finish the third heat. He touched out at 58 seconds and then, instead of pulling himself out with any dignity, he got out of the water awkwardly, coughing, his face a mottled red. His friends had gone very quiet. The crowd, on the other hand, erupted. Not in mockery, exactly, but in the way crowds do when they've witnessed something genuinely unexpected and impressive. Phones came out. People were recording, cheering, and I could see several resort staff members clapping. The sports director was looking at me with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone who'd just realized they were looking at a real athlete, not just someone who'd challenged a gym enthusiast to a race. I climbed out of the pool, water streaming off me, my breathing already evening out. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, but there was something else there too. Clarity. A sense of rightness that I'd been missing for years. Jim Bro was standing a few feet away from me, still dripping, his massive frame somehow less intimidating now that I'd seen him fail at the one thing I knew he'd expected to dominate. His friends were no longer laughing along with him. They'd stopped laughing entirely. I could have said something cutting. Could have delivered the speech I'd rehearsed about judging people by appearances, about making assumptions, about the damage his cruelty had caused. I'd had it all prepared, sharp and perfect. But standing there, wrapping a towel around myself, I realized I didn't need to. The race had said everything that needed to be said. Instead, I looked directly at him and said, simply, that's what happens when you judge someone without knowing their story. Then I turned and walked toward the bleachers, where Marcus was waiting with a towel and a smile that looked like pride. As I climbed the steps, the crowd moved aside for me. People were congratulating me, telling me they'd recorded it, asking if I was a professional athlete. A young girl, maybe 12, asked me for my autograph. An older woman told me I'd inspired her to go back to the swimming lessons she'd quit after menopause. I signed the girl's towel with the pen someone handed me, and something crystallized inside me. This feeling, this purpose, this sense of being seen and valued for something real, this was what I'd been missing. Not the competition itself, but the meaning behind it. The knowledge that you could do something that mattered, that could inspire people, that could be beautiful. When I reached Marcus, he pulled me into his arms, towel and all, and whispered against my hair, "Welcome back." And I understood what he meant. Not just coming back to the pool, but coming back to myself. The self I'd buried, the self I'd hidden, the self that was too big and too ambitious and too much for the comfortable life I'd tried to build. I was done being small. Behind me, I could hear Jim Bro's friends talking to him, and he was saying something about how I probably used to do something with swimming, probably had some background. He was trying to minimize, to rationalize his defeat. But I didn't care what he thought anymore. I had myself back. And that was worth more than any victory.